Some serial killers prefer to work in pairs, even if at times they don't seem to get along. So was the case of the Hillside Stranglers. Angelo Buono Jr. and his cousin Kenneth Bianchi. In the mid-70s to the early 80s, Los Angeles had quickly become a dangerous place for women at night, particularly for those who worked the streets. Debbie Farringer operated on the busy streets of West Hollywood, and in the back of her mind was always the fear of serial killers.
There were so many in Los Angeles that year. You know, the Night Stalker, and there was the freeway, it was crazy. And many more that was never publicized.
Bianchi had a fairly normal upbringing, even to the point of wanting to join the seminary to become a Catholic priest. Buono was brought up as a Catholic, but neither his religion or his public education had much impact on him. He was described as a spiritually, morally, and academically limited man. By the time they both linked up, they had already shared a long list of criminal activity, from grand theft auto to assault and rape. In 1977, their real reign of terror was only beginning. Buono, a self-confessed ladies' man, persuaded Bianchi to join him in prostituting two women. Both women were held against their will. The domination of these women started a chain reaction of torture, rape, and murder. Two years later, this unlikely bond had claimed the lives of 10 documented serial killer victims. Bianchi and Buono were labeled the Hillside Strangler, as the police had yet to discover that there was more than one killer. The police had linked the killings together as each of the victims' naked bodies were dumped on the hillsides around Los Angeles. The two killers cruised around L.A. in Buono's car, often posing as undercover police officers. They would then order the victims into the car, drive to Buono's home, and torture and murder them. The irony in this was that Bianchi had applied for a job with the LAPD and had even taken rides with officers while they were searching for the Hillside Strangler. This was part of a program where civilians were able to ride with officers as their way to educate the community. His two failed applications to join the police force fortunately prevented him from becoming an even more dangerous killer. Their first victim was 19-year-old Yolanda Washington. Her naked body was found on a hillside off the Ventura Freeway in October 1977. Faint marks were visible on her neck, wrists, and ankles, where a rope had burned her skin. She had also been raped. Yolanda was known to Buono and Bianchi. She'd made the mistake of crossing them when a deal on a client or trick list was not what it was said to be.
They killed Yolanda Washington because her and Debbie, a girl named Debbie, sold Kenneth and Angelo a book, a trick book they called it, and it was numbers of clients, and it was fake. And you know, they're pissed, and they can't find the original girl. Her name was Debbie. They knew that she worked on Sunset Boulevard with Candy. Candy knew that she had died. She told me that the Hillside Strangler had killed her, and they went and found her, and that was at one time the second person, but then they said that she was the first person, and that's how they started, because they went after her to pay her back, and she wasn't even the person that sold the book. She was just a friend.
Yolanda's murder was an act of revenge, but the taste for killing had begun. On November 1st, police were called to La Crescenta, northeast of downtown Los Angeles, where the body of a naked teenage girl had been found. Judith Lynn Miller had been a runaway with drug problems. Her small and thin body contained ligature marks on her neck, wrists, and ankles. A resident of this middle-class suburb had covered her body to prevent children from viewing her on their way to school. Forensic analysis revealed that Judith had been raped, murdered, and then dumped, indicating that she'd been killed elsewhere. 5 days later, on November 6th, the nude body of another woman was discovered close to the Chevy Chase Country Club in Glendale. She bore ligature marks and had been raped and strangled. The woman was later identified as 21-year-old Alyssa Teresa, a waitress and dancer. On November 13th, two girls, 12-year-old Dolores Cepeda and 14-year-old Sonia Johnson, boarded a school bus from St. Ignatius School and headed home. After leaving the bus, they were seen approaching a two-tone sedan with two men inside. Both were later found on a hillside near Dodgers Stadium. Earlier on the same day, hikers found the naked body of 20-year-old Christina Weckler, a hard-working honors student at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. She was discovered on a hillside between Glendale and Eagle Rock. Again, like with all previous bodies, ligature marks were evident on her wrists, ankles, and neck. Christina had also been tortured and raped. Finally, on November 23rd, after the discovery of victim number 7, Evelyn Jane King, an aspiring actress, the response authorities formed a task force to catch the predator now dubbed the Hillside Strangler. Evelyn's badly decomposed body was found near the Los Feliz off-ramp of the Golden State Freeway. She'd been raped, tortured, and strangled. She was 28 years old. On November 29th, police found the body of Lauren Ray Wagner, a business student. She'd been snatched from outside her family home in Glendale's Mount Washington. She'd been bound, raped, and murdered in the same way as the previous victims. The police were no closer to catching the Hillside Strangler, and even at this stage still believed that it was a lone killer. Debbie Farringer and her friend Kimberly Martin were working the streets at this time, and Kimberly was taking some risks.
She had a hard time bouncing from person to person because she was known as a runner because they put high demands on her, and she couldn't make that amount of money. She would have to go somewhere else, and then, and first she started out working for 2 guys at the same time when she was 12. Yeah, and I mean, she had a horrible life. And she was just, she just jumped in car blind faith and came to Los Angeles. And I didn't like her at first. She was preferred to work by herself alone at night, And I think it was sort of a rivalry between us two. We would be friends, but then, there was the man in the middle. I moved to West Hollywood and she moved to Beverly Hills, and we got closer there because we worked escort. We shared a car, Everything we did together. Me and my son and her would dress up together and, go places, go to the park or whatever.
On December 14th, 1977, Debbie Farringer was working as a call girl. Her friend Kimberly Martin, also known as Candy, was on the lookout for a customer. In the end, it was fate that was going to cost one life and save another. When the phone rang, the job could have gone either way.
It was one call a day. I would answer the phone, so I got that one call. If not one red flag went up, I wouldn't take it. I looked for reasons not to take the call. They had to be in a hotel. They had to have verifiable information from the state. They had to have certain things.
The call had come from the Hollywood Public Library and not from a payphone.
I didn't get the initial call. I didn't screen the call. I relied on this woman that I never met, and she didn't verify that it wasn't a payphone. The payphones at that time in the 9, and it wasn't the Hollywood Library. It wasn't a 9. She came to my house that evening. She ate at my house that night. I was busy. She answered my phone. She asked me to go with her, and I told her she'd be okay. One thing you do it was escort. It's escort now. It was out call then. You have a driver, and if you don't go in and check in, then, and we relied on pagers then, If you got in, you got the money, everything's okay, you call. Okay. And then an hour, 15 minutes usually, but if an hour went by and you didn't check out after you come out, you stopped at payphone and call and say, okay, I'm out, if your driver wasn't with you, because I started going alone. That night she went alone because she had worked all day packing her apartment. And next thing I know, she's looking at her hair, making sure she's still blonde, and left. And that was it. Well, after she asked me if I would go with her, I told her to lock her stuff, her valuables in a trunk, because it was a convertible, and I gave her the money that I owed the service for her to pay for me, and she was just looking in the mirror. I was wondering why she isn't leaving, and she's looking in the mirror, and she had just dyed her hair back to her natural color, and she said, do I still look like a blonde? And it's like, girl, come on, you got it. You're not gonna be looking at her hair, And I think that was just probably her way of not wanting to go.
Kimberly Martin's body was found in Echo Park. Her short life was taken by the Hillside Stranglers. The police began to link cases together, and as soon as it became known that the killer or killers were impersonating officers, a blanket of fear began to creep over the LA community. The police were relentless in their search for the killers, even to the point of bringing in a psychic from Germany. But had they paid more attention to the psychic's report that two Italians, brothers, aged around 35, could be the suspects, they might have caught the killers sooner. The psychic's analysis was close to the truth. On the morning of the 17th of February 1978, a helicopter spotted an orange Datsun abandoned in a ravine off the Angeles Crest Highway. In the car was the body of 20-year-old Cindy Lee Hudspeth, a student and part-time waitress. Her body had been placed in the trunk of the car and then pushed over the cliff. She had been strangled, raped, and tortured in the same way as previous victims. The eventual breakthrough came through one small incident, and this was also a factor in the killers parting company with each other. Susan Rassanen was a young girl when they approached her at a bus stop. She managed to run away but was pursued by Bianchi, who yelled out to Buono that she was like a little jackrabbit, and best they let her be. Susan was able to give detectives a good description of the two men. But after this failure, Bianchi revealed to Buono that he participated in LA police car rides. Buono flew into a rage and threatened to kill Bianchi if he did not move away from LA. Bianchi decided to move and fled back to Bellingham, Washington to live with his girlfriend Kelly Boyd. By 1979, Bianchi was leading a normal life, working as a security guard, but the lure of murder returned. He managed to convince two students, 22-year-old Karen Mandick and 27-year-old Diane Wilder, to come with him to a house he'd been guarding. Without help from Buono, he murdered both girls, but this time he left many clues. The police were better prepared than those in LA and swooped in on him the very next day. A routine background check linked him to addresses of two Hillside Strangler victims. His arrest on January 12, 1979 was without incident. The arrest of Buono would take another 9 months. During 2 years behind bars, Bianchi formed a relationship with Veronica Lynn Compton, an actress and playwright. So close was their bond, Bianchi managed to convince Compton to perform a copycat Hillside Strangler killing to prove his innocence. Compton lured a woman to a motel room and attempted to strangle her. She then planned to leave some of Bianchi's semen in the room, which would have thrown doubts on Bianchi's conviction. Compton had smuggled the semen out of prison in a rubber glove. The plot failed when she was overpowered and arrested. She was eventually charged and would serve 2 years behind bars. The case against Buono was largely based on Bianchi's testimony. Buono's trial would become the longest in American history, lasting from November 1981 until November 1983. Debbie Farringer was a witness in the trial.
Looking at him, it was everything I expected, everything I anticipated, the evil there. You can't hide that kind of evil. There was nowhere to hide it. It was there, and it was hard to look at him. And I think that's why I concentrated on his attorney, and she was being female, you know. She was less of a threat, I guess.
His sentence of life imprisonment without parole was cut short. He was found dead in his cell from a heart attack on the 21st of September, 2002. Bianchi is currently serving a life sentence in Washington State Penitentiary.
I still think about him as the images that from the 70s, you know. I still think of him as that young and, you know, a smart punk kid that wanted to be a cop so bad he pretended to be one, you know. Power he had over people, he took it to the limit. And Angelo was already there. He was a master of women. He was a smooth talker, you know. He would convince anybody of anything.
The Hillside Stranglers were proven to be vicious cowards, attacking and killing helpless young women and creating an uneasy fear on the streets of Los Angeles. For Debbie Farringer, life went on.
I am still that same little girl, you know. I have my moments where, I don't know, I have my moments where I feel that I don't even know how it's possible that I survived, you know? I mean, looking death in the face so many times in the streets and just saying, okay, you know, and just being the person I was to walk through that. I think if the tables were turned, though, she would have taken a much different path. I know she would have. I know she would have.
It's difficult to understand how people become serial killers. There are some early signs, and in the case of Richard Ramirez, there could have been multiple reasons. Ramirez was brought up in a strictly Catholic family. Abuse from his father started at an early age, but he also suffered epilepsy and had twice received head injuries. Once when a dresser fell on his head and he needed 30 stitches, and at a playground where a swing hit him in the back of the head. But all of this was only the beginning. By 10 years old, he was smoking marijuana and sleeping in a cemetery to avoid further abuse from his father. The real influence on his life that eventually led him to become a serial killer was his association with his cousin, Mike Ramirez. Mike was a decorated U.S. Army Green Beret. He boasted of his exploits in Vietnam, and even shared Polaroid images of himself posing with the severed heads of Vietnamese women. Richard bonded with his cousin and loved to hear the gory stories from the war. Mike also supplied Richard with marijuana and allowed him to shoot his firearms. Richie, as his family called him, was witness to Mike's fatal shooting of his wife Jessie. So close was Richie to the domestic argument, he was splattered with Jessie's blood when she was shot in the face by Mike. After this incident, Richie became sullen and withdrawn from his family, but this only led him to his brother-in-law Roberto, who took Richie on his peeping Tom nocturnal exploits. It was about this time that Richie developed an interest in Satanism, and from here his pathway had sadly become clear. He picked up a job at a local Holiday Inn, where instead of being the model employee, he took to robbing items out of the rooms. It all ended abruptly when he attempted to rob and rape a female guest. He was caught by a returning husband, who then beat Ramirez senseless. No charges were laid as the victim did not pursue the matter any further. The stage was finally set. Ramirez's sexual fantasies and violence had come to the fore, and it was from here his real story began. It was hard to find excuses for Richie's subsequent behavior, no matter what had happened in his childhood and youth. It was at this point he moved to California. His killing spree began on April 10, 1984. His first victim was 9-year-old May Leung. She was found murdered in a hotel basement in San Francisco.
Right before he died, there was a little Asian girl that they found, and they linked him up to the murder. And she had lost $1. Her brother had hidden it downstairs in the basement, and I guess Richie was asleep down there. And Richie, he killed her, you know, and they found her slumped over the water hydrant.
It wasn't until 2009 that Ramirez's DNA was finally matched to the killing. On June 28, 1984, his second victim was found. 79-year-old Jenny Vincow was found brutally murdered in her apartment in Grassel Park, Los Angeles. She'd been stabbed repeatedly while asleep in her bed. The third victim, Maria Hernandez, was attacked outside her home and shot in the face. She survived, but her roommate Dale Okazaki was killed. An hour later, 30-year-old Veronica Yu of Monterey Park became the next victim. She was shot twice and died on arrival at the hospital. The two murders and a third attempt in a single day attracted extensive media attention. The killing spree had only just begun, and each crime was more sadistic and violent. On July 5, 1985, Ramirez broke into a home in Sierra Madre and bludgeoned sleeping 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a tire iron. He then tried to electrocute her, but when he saw sparks fly out from the cord, he feared that Christ had intervened and saved her. She survived, but needed 476 stitches to her scalp. 2 days later, he burglarized the home of Joyce Nelson in Monterey Park. Finding her asleep, he beat her to death with his fists and by kicking her in the head. A shoe print from his obvious sneaker was left imprinted on her face. On the same day, he bound and attempted to rape Sophie Dickman. When she swore that he had all her jewelry, he made her swear on Satan that this was true and no more valuables were hidden in the house. Sophie survived, and the case began to have many leads for the police to follow. Richard Ramirez's niece, Shelley Ramirez, found out about her infamous uncle long after he'd been arrested.
He did a lot of bad things and hurt a lot of people. And through doing all these interviews, it's gotten harder because I've met a lot of people and learned a lot of things that I didn't know about. My grandma, she never saw no wrong in anything Richie did. That was her son. That was her mijo, and you don't look at him wrong. You never turn your back on your son.
But Richie's robberies, murders, and assaults were increasing. On July 20th, 1985 in Glendale, he killed Maxim and Layla Needing with a machete as they lay sleeping. Later on the same day, he drove to Sun Valley, where he murdered Changarong Kovananth with a handgun and then raped his wife Somkid, afterwards asking her to swear to Satan that she wasn't hiding any valuables. Just 2 weeks later in Northridge, Chris and Virginia Peterson were shot but managed to fight Ramirez off. Both survived. 2 days later, he was in Diamond Bar, where he shot and killed 31-year-old Elise Abawarth and repeatedly raped his 27-year-old wife, Sakina. He demanded that she swore to Satan that she would not scream during the assaults. More crimes followed in Los Angeles and in San Francisco. The death toll was mounting. Peter and Barbara Pan were shot in their home in the Bay Area of San Francisco. As the evidence mounted, so too did the publicity. Ramirez became known as the Night Stalker. On August 24th, Ramirez traveled back to L.A. to Mission Viejo and broke into the house of Bill Carnes, 30, and his fiancée, Inez Erickson. He shot Carnes 3 times, then told Erickson he was the Night Stalker and made her swear to Satan as she was beaten and raped.
I met Bill. He's an amazing man. I have a lot of respect for him. He and I, we talked, and I helped him to, come at ease with all of this and give him closure. Bill is out there and, got shot in the head 3 times. He was going to be an engineer. He had his life set. He had a fiance, and she left him after, everything. It was so traumatizing because Richie raped his fiance when I met him. And, it was just really sad.
As Ramirez left Carnes' house, he was spotted by 13-year-old neighbor James Romero. He'd seen Ramirez earlier that day and thought he was creepy. Romero was able to give police the plate number of the orange Toyota Ramirez was driving. The stolen car was found on August 28th in Wiltshire, and police were able to lift 1 fingerprint. But it was enough to identify Ramirez from past petty crimes he'd committed. They even had a photo which was now released to the public. Police at the time said, "We know who you are now, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place for you to hide." On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez, who'd been following the press conferences and media frenzy, caught a bus to Tucson, Arizona to visit his brother Robert, Shelley's father. By then, he'd been the lead story on every news channel and newspaper in California. He arrived in Tucson but did not meet his brother. On the return journey, he casually walked through the bus station, but was identified by some locals in East Los Angeles. He attempted to carjack a woman, but was soon overpowered by a group of residents who beat him across the head with a metal bar. The group held him down until police were able to arrest him.
When Richie got caught, I was in the living room with my dad, and my dad and I were watching TV, and it was just like breaking news, breaking news. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, has been caught, blah, blah, blah. And they had him in the backseat of a car, and he had this white thing all wrapped up, and they beat the shit out of him, like, so bad. Like, they beat the crap out of him really bad. And my dad's face looked like he saw a ghost.
In his first court appearance, Ramirez held his hand high with a pentagram drawn on it and yelled out, "Hail Satan." He was convicted on all charges. 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The family of Ramirez attended the court most of the days of the trial.
We were sitting in the courtroom, and I remember my grandpa, my grandma. It was my grandpa right here, my grandma right here, and then my dad, and then my mom and me. It was crazy. Like, they were really mean. Like, I remember we were walking out and people were yelling and throwing stuff, and my mom was like blocking, and I remember she was just like pushing her hand, and I remember she was even trying to protect his mom, my dad's mom, and my dad.
Richard Ramirez was a committed Satanist. He never expressed any regret for his crimes. The sentencing judge described his deeds as cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond any human understanding. Ramirez, the Night Stalker, received the death sentence. He stated to the assembled journalists, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." This original sketch he made in prison shows that Disneyland was an ongoing theme in his letters and his art. What it means has never been fully understood. In prison, Ramirez was often visited by so-called fans, even though many of his surviving victims describing him as having extreme body odor, rotten teeth, and bad breath. One admirer, Doreen Loy, wrote 75 letters to him, and in 1988 he proposed to her, and they were married in prison in October 1996. Shelley Ramirez struggles to describe the time she visited him in prison, accompanied by her Aunt Rosa and Richie's new wife, Doreen.
It was a long walk. You walk forever. You get cleared. The doors are very loud, like the sounding of the slamming of the gates. They're really loud. The guards, just kind of walk through. They check your ID, make sure that you're that person. You get checked a lot, and you go through a lot of alarms. Your clothing has to be a very precise way. Like, you can't wear jeans, I remember that. Jewelry is limited. It was really weird. When I was little, my dad used to tell me, you should be a lawyer so you can help get Richie out and fight for him. And, I was little, so I didn't know. I would tell him in his letters, like, I'm going to be a lawyer so I can get you out of jail. So we went to the jail, and we were sitting there. My aunt was on the side, and I said hi to him at first when we first got there. Doreen was on the left side, and they asked me if I wanted anything from the vending machine. So I didn't want anything. She got cookies, and my aunt got a soda. And I just remember them telling me to stand against the wall, and the guards weren't really paying attention. They kind of planned it out. I don't know, he stood up and he started jacking off, and my aunt was pushing her nails into my cheek, and she was telling me to watch him, and I had the phone to my ear, and he had chains on him, because when they go in, the guards are real cautious on how they let them in or whatever, so he's still chained up. I didn't really understand what the hell was going on. He was jacking off, and he told me if I wasn't his niece that he would fuck me any day, and I just kind of went into shock. I didn't really know what to say, and I just gave the phone to my aunt. I remember I looked back at the guards, and they were all laughing, and I remember I've always thought about that, why weren't they watching? There was a kid, I was a little girl. They should have been more cautious, knowing that he was a serial killer. He scared me. He scared the hell out of me. Then he told me, why did I have a gold cross on? That Satanists, only Satanists, that the Satanists don't wear gold. and he was like mad, and he wanted me to put it inside my dress. I was wearing a dress, and like, because before he had jacked off in front of me, he had me stand against the wall, and he was like, you know, I'm just thinking he wanted to look at my dress, and I used to have really long hair, so I was like, oh, okay, you know, he's just trying to look at my hair, and he was like, you know, let me see your hair, and I remember him telling me, like, are you nervous? And I was like, no, and he's like, look into my eyes, and so I remember it was, you know, I looked into his eyes, and it was so weird. Like, for the longest time, I thought it was crazy, you know, because it seemed like his eyes from this end started kind of like swerving, you know, into the inner part. And until I got to be like about 22 or 23, I started hearing, my dad told me that they started blindfolding my uncle, that the guards were scared to move him because he was doing that to them, and that it was making them feel weird, and that they were getting scared, and that he was telling them bad stuff was going to happen to them, and bad stuff would happen to them or their family.
Throughout his imprisonment, Ramirez wrote letters to his brother, many of which talked about Satanism. His letters to Robert started off as being positive and mentioned his appeals and other court-related matters. But as the years went on, the letters became more and more scrambled and often deteriorated into abuse and revenge. Ramirez was on death row at San Quentin prison for over 23 years, but he never faced the executioner. Instead, it was cancer that eventually took his life on June 7, 2013. Shelley Ramirez still carries the scars of her incident at the prison and for being a relative of one of the most vicious serial killers in modern times.
I'm trying, you know, I think I've come a long way compared to when I was younger. You know, it bothered me a lot.
The day she visited him in San Quentin was the last time she ever saw her uncle. Given the opportunity, she would have wanted to know more.
I would go see him, I think, and I would ask him, like, why did he do that to me? And I think I would just try to understand him more, you know, because I know he was sick at the end. I'm just telling the truth of what happened and how I remember it and what I know happened. And as far as me shaming him, I've forgiven him. I don't hold, like, hate or anything, because it just grows inside of you if you hold hate. But does it hurt? Yeah, like, I mean, you know, it's sad what he did to those people. It's sad that he did that shit to me. Like, there was no reason for him to do it. And, you know, he did a lot of sick shit. I don't really know how else to explain it.
Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, seemed to have 9 lives when it came to escaping the police. He was questioned as many times, and over a 5-year period he seemed to get away with murder. Born June 2, 1946 in Bingley in the West Riding of Yorkshire, Sutcliffe had an unremarkable childhood. He left school at 15 and went on to work menial jobs, married and at one point living with his in-laws between 1975 and 1980. He sought out and brutally attacked women while his wife was at work or at home in bed.
Every serial killer I've ever got involved with, I've learned to go right back to the beginning, to go back to the earliest days of their childhood. The thing about Sutcliffe was he was a loner. He was always a loner. He was almost trapped in his own world, really. And one of his early jobs, he loved being a gravedigger. He used to love the interaction with the corpses and the coffins and this sort of thing, which again, it's not natural. I mean, it's not natural that someone would have this affinity with that. In fact, when Sutcliffe left, apparently he came back and did a second turn of being a gravedigger. People like that find it almost impossible to be socially normal when it comes to a relationship. They find getting girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever it is, they find it very, very difficult. And Sutcliffe was the same. He used to go out, because he lived in Bradford and around that area, there were lots of prostitutes, but he used to go and spy on them. He would get his sexual kicks not out of being with a physical woman, but by a voyeurism, by watching other people, you see. He would then try it himself, and he had a few interactions with prostitutes himself. But it meant that when he was trying to have a normal life, he couldn't. It was difficult. So he needed to get his sexual kicks outside of the home.
Sutcliffe was a cruel, calculated killer who showed no mercy with the young women he picked up. claiming he was ridding the streets of filth by killing young sex workers. He invited them into his car and drove them to a secluded spot nearby, where he would beat them over the head with a hammer before slashing or stabbing them multiple times.
He used to hit them from behind and cave their skulls in with a ball-peen hammer. He used to then have a screwdriver or a long-handled knife, and he'd then mutilate the genitals and the breasts and everything. This is typical sexual homicide. This is someone who's got a real sexual problem, and they're living out this sort of sexual fantasy. And sometimes these guys can actually spontaneously orgasm while they're stabbing the victim. Isn't it bizarre? You know, absolutely bizarre.
After previously attacking at least 2 women, his first known murder took place on October 30th, 1975, in Chapeltown in Leeds. Wilma McCann was bludgeoned with a hammer to the head, stabbed 15 times, and left in a field, moments from where she lived and where her 4 children were sleeping. She was 28 years old. 3 months later, on January 20th, 1976, again in Leeds, 42-year-old Emily Jackson was hit over the head with a hammer and stabbed 51 times in the throat, chest, and abdomen with a screwdriver. A muddy size 7 boot print was found on her thigh. Irene Richardson was attacked and killed on February 5, 1976, in Roundhay Park, Leeds. Again, after using the hammer to knock her to the ground, she was mutilated with a knife. Tire tracks were left near the scene. Sutcliffe was now hooked, and on April 23rd, Patricia Atkinson was brutally murdered in her Bradford flat. A bloody boot print, the same as found on Emily Jackson, was left on the bedsheets, but police were no closer to finding the man responsible. When 16-year-old Jane McDonald, a shop assistant, was found dead on June 26, 1977 in a playground, all women in the community started to fear they could be next. The press finally started to notice what was going on. Sutcliffe simply needed to satisfy his thirst for blood and murdered her on her way home from a night out with friends. Having caused chaos in the Leeds and Bradford area and now being dubbed Ripper, Sutcliffe started traveling further out to satisfy his urges. On October 1st, he drove to Manchester and killed 20-year-old Jean Jordan. Soon after, he realized he'd given her a freshly minted £5 note that could be traced back to him. When the body had not been found 9 days later, he went back, threw her belongings around, and mutilated her corpse, slicing her open and attempting to cut off her head with a hacksaw in frustration at not finding the evidence. When police found the £5 note hidden in a small compartment in her handbag, they twice pulled Sutcliffe in for questioning, along with 5,000 other men, but were satisfied he was not the Ripper and let him free. On January 21, 1978, Yvonne Pearson was taken to a wasteland in Bradford. Severely beaten, her mouth stuffed with horsehair from a dumped sofa, it would be 2 months before the single mother of 2 would be found. 10 days later, he took teenager Helen Reitka to a timber yard in Huddersfield, raped her as she lay barely conscious, her skull beaten in with a hammer. She was also stabbed in the lungs and heart. Mother of 7, Vera Millward, was found the 16th of May 1978 in the grounds of the Manchester Royal Infirmary. Again beaten over the head with a hammer, he slashed her stomach open, rolled her over, and left her for dead. April 4th, upon seeing 19-year-old Josephine Whitaker taking a shortcut through Seville Park after visiting her grandparents, Sutcliffe parked his car and walked with her, even telling her, "You don't know who you can trust these days." He beat her over the head with a hammer and stabbed her 27 times with a sharp screwdriver. Her skull had been fractured from ear to ear. Despite forensic evidence, police turned their focus to the source of videos and letters, proven later to be a hoax.
Sutcliffe was very, very lucky insofar as when he started killing his victims, he did it in different areas, but he did it in different police force areas. So he was in Leeds and Bradford and Manchester around there. So the problem with law enforcement worldwide is they don't talk to each other. So you get one of the Ripper's murders, say in West Yorkshire, you get another one in Leeds, you get another one in another constabulary, and there's too many of them in the UK. There's 43 constabularies, which is really quite silly. The 70s and 80s, it was even worse when they wouldn't talk to each other. So he was able to keep on moving, and he'd always use his car to go looking for victims.
In the early hours of Sunday, the 2nd of September, another victim, Bradford University student Barbara Leach, was found dumped under a pile of bricks close to her lodgings. 7 months later, in April 1980, Sutcliffe was arrested for drunk driving. Again, not deterred by his actions with police, he went on to kill twice more while awaiting trial for the minor offense. 47-year-old civil servant Marguerite Walls was in the wrong place at the wrong time on August 20th, 1980. Sutcliffe was in a filthy mood and decided to take it out on her by following her before looping rope around her neck and strangling her. His final victim, Jacqueline Hill, was a 20-year-old Leeds University student. She was murdered on November 17th, 1980. As she was walking, he hit her over the head, dragged her to some wasteland, and stabbed her in the eye and stomach. One of the largest investigations by a British police force finally came to an end on January 2nd, 1981, when Sutcliffe was stopped by police for having false plates on his car.
When he was finally arrested, they found that he had, I suppose you could call it, an upside-down pullover on his legs. He would have an inverted V-neck sweater, which he'd put his legs through the arms, so he'd pull the sweater up here, which meant that his genitals were exposed, when he was actually doing the killing. And he would have padded arms, which would cover his knees. So while he was kneeling next to the victim, he was nice and comfy while he was doing all his mutilations. So the progression of Sutcliffe was horrendous. He was getting worse and worse and worse with the violence. So not only would Sutcliffe go prepared for his crimes, he'd have ball-peen hammers, he'd have knives, he'd have screwdrivers, this sort of thing. He'd actually dress for the part as well, and he was getting worse and worse and worse. To get a sexual buzz, he needed to be more and more violent with the victims, which is tragically the way a lot of the serial killers go.
At large, it's quite possible that he probably killed 100 odd women. He's been admitting to more here, there and everywhere, right, over time. But again, if you read any books about the Yorkshire Ripper, and there's been plenty written, by all accounts, within 6 months of him being incarcerated for life in Broadmoor Mental Hospital for the Criminally Insane, he was getting marriage proposals by letter. Why? His big thing was he took an hammer out with him, and they'd say he left their skulls like a bag of marbles. And my uncle worked, he was a policeman, and I said, what's they mean that left their skulls like a bag of marbles? He said he means he bashed it with an hammer that often, that the skin was all that was keeping it together. When you held it, it felt like a bag of marbles.
Throughout the Yorkshire Ripper's reign of terror, he had viciously attacked over 20 women, killing 13, seriously injuring 8, and leaving 25 children without their mothers.
When you meet them face to face, it's like you and me talking. They're just completely normal. He's got a very strong Yorkshire accent. He's an incredibly selfish man. He's only thinking of me. Me. What would I say to him? The one question everyone wants to ask is why, but I know why. The man was a sexual misfit. He didn't fit. He's terrorised an area of England for several years. He enjoyed it. The thing about Sutcliffe was he would plan his killings, he would go to the area where women were on their own, he would attack them, and then he'd kill them virtually the same time, because that was the way he used to operate. But he would always leave the bodies to be found. A lot of people bury bodies, hide them. No. Sutcliffe got his buzz from reading the newspapers the next day. So as soon as he could get hold of a newspaper and he'd pick it up and read it, he'd enjoy. Part of the buzz would be the horror everyone felt about this murder. So what would I say to Sutcliffe? Go to hell and never come back.